It's Tuesday, it's tea time, let's talk. Today we're going to talk about Big Four patterns, and I am drinking a milk tea made with Bramble and Rose's Earl Grey de la Creme. It's one of my favorites. So a Big Four pattern, what even is that? This is a term in the community that we use to refer to a big company, Simplicity, McCall's, Butterick, Vogue. There are a couple of subsidiary companies that anything under that umbrella counts as a Big Four. I think they're all owned by the same company now, which for better or worse, it is what it is. These patterns are readily available in a lot of big box stores. You can go into Joann. In fact, they often have sales where you can get like Simplicity patterns for $1.99 or McCall's patterns for 99 cents. And Vogue often goes on sale for $5.99 a piece. I highly recommend watching out for these sales to pick the patterns up. Some common mistakes that I see beginners make when they're using a Big Four pattern for the first time is that, number one, they will pick out a pattern according to their clothing size as opposed to their measurements. Please, please, please always look at the measurement chart. There's one in the pattern book in the big box store. There's one on the website, and there's usually in the envelope, there's a little flap that tucks in. If you look on that flap, that is usually where the measurements for the sizes are. You'll usually have two different size envelopes, and one will be the smaller sizes, one will be the larger sizes. That does occasionally differ. Check your sizes. These patterns are usually multi-size, which means that they are stacked so that you'll have 8, 10, 12, 14 that are graded right next to each other. Here's another mistake that I often see is that people will cut out, say they're a 10, they'll cut out along the 10 line and then the 12 and 14 sizes just get thrown away. Please don't do that. Please cut out the largest size of your pattern, and then when you put it on your fabric, just fold the excess out of the way. If you have sizes that differ, like your bust is a size 14 and your waist is a size 16 and your hips are a size 14, you can grade those when you cut the pattern out. And if you get bigger and you have thrown away the larger size grading, you're either going to have to grade it up yourself, which is a pain and nobody really wants to do that, or you're going to have to buy the pattern again when you could have just cut out the largest size to begin with, folded it back, and used that when you're creating your project. So please don't throw away what you're not going to use. If you happen to sell that pattern later on the secondhand market, somebody might want, the size 16. Just plan for longevity, okay? Unless otherwise noted, all of these patterns are going to have a 5/8 inch seam allowance. A lot of indie patterns will have like a 2 centimeter or a 1/2 inch seam allowance. With a Big Four pattern, it'll say in the instructions, and it'll often say on the pattern itself, if the seam differs from the standard 5/8 inch seam allowance. Anything else that doesn't say what the seam allowance is going to be a 5/8 inch seam allowance. The reason that's important is that if you have a pattern that gives you a 5/8 inch seam allowance and you sew it with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, you are adding an 1/8 inch to every seam. So that adds up. If you have princess seams on the front and the back, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 seams times 1/8. That's 6/8 of an inch that you're adding. So if you're making a corset or something where it's skin tight, that matters. It really, really matters. It adds up. So please be really mindful of your seam allowance. I like to take a piece of washi tape and mark my common seam allowance. Mine is usually marked at 5/8 of an inch. Just be mindful when you go to sew your project that your seam allowance is actually what the intended seam allowance is supposed to be. Also, make a mock-up. These Big Four patterns tend to include a lot of wearing ease, which means the idea of what we have in our head as to what the finished garment is going to look like is usually a little bit tighter than the intended ease that these patterns ship out with. If you're used to sewing with indie patterns and you come to a Big Four, you will find that there's quite a lot of ease. You can look at the bottom of the back of the pattern envelope and it will usually give you a finished garment size that includes the wearing ease. So this is another thing to check. If you have a 34-inch bust and the finished garment size says it is a 34-inch bust, that pattern is not going to fit you unless it is made of super stretchy material and it is supposed to be skin tight. The ease that you're going to want is going to be dependent on your wants and your needs. The industry standard does have like vaguely standard amounts of ease that they add. It's not always comfortable for a person. We all have different sensory needs, so please make sure you do a mock-up and check your finished pattern measurements. Some people can get away with just looking at the measurements, but those people usually have a lot of experience with doing stuff for their body and they know what they want, and they have usually worked with a pattern line long enough to know what the finished product is gonna generally be. Please, if you are a beginner, you have to prototype. Like, you like sewing. You like this. This is your hobby. You get to do it more, okay? Prototype, please. Get a friend to help you fit. It's much easier. Make a mock-up. Pattern markings and notches are fairly standard across the big four. Your notches are going to be a triangle, and these have meaning that you can kind of sort of glean it from experience. But often, like, if nobody points it out, I sewed with big four patterns for like 10 years before somebody was like, oh yeah, on a sleeve, the double notch means that it's the back. The single notch means that it's the front. Never computed in my head. They're your truing marks, your registration marks. Mind your notches, mind your other marks on your patterns. There are often big circles that help you match up 2 points that are going to meet. There can be squares. There are also small circles. Sometimes these denote buttons. Sometimes these denote where two seams intersect. The marks are there to help you in your construction to get everything lined up correctly. They give you everything that you need. Speaking of instructions, if you bought firsthand, your pattern will include 2, sometimes 3, but the third page is usually in Spanish. If it is included, pages of newsprint instructions that will guide you through the steps. Sometimes they can be very confusing in the wording as to like what it's instructing you to do, but most of the time it's going to be fairly clear. Sew this seam, understitch here, hem this up. It's going to tell you, put your interfacing on this piece, and they try to be very consistent with their imagery. So the front of the fabric will have one printed texture on it and the back of the fabric will have another. So if you pay attention to how those look, you can refer to the key or the guide that tells you what everything means. Most, if not all, of the pattern instructions have a section in them that is like a glossary that will tell you what the symbols mean. If you follow those instructions, you are pretty much guaranteed to get a final product that looks like the picture on the envelope. Not everyone follows those instructions. Sometimes it turns out great and sometimes it does not, and we generally don't speak of the times that it turns out bad. We generally go, oh, I should have followed the pattern instructions. That's why they say to do it in this order. But there have been multiple times where I've looked at pattern instructions and I'm like, why are they telling me to do it in this order? And been like, no, I'm not going to do that, because I, for one, I don't like setting in my sleeve with my side seam not sewn. I know that there are people who love to do that, and if you're one of them, more power to you. Whatever works for you. I am all about the freedom to choose, and I choose to set my sleeves in the round. I will ignore the pattern if it says to set the sleeve in and then sew the sleeve and body seam up in one go. No, I'm not doing that. I refuse. Sorry. Not happening. So you're allowed, if you know what you're doing, if you have the experience under your belt, if you know how to set a seam in the round instead of flat, and you want to do it that way, I give you permission to not follow the instructions. But if you are a beginner and you are making your first garment, please follow the instructions for your first time. Please trust in the instructions of the pattern company. that they are providing you with a roadmap to a finished product. Thank you for watching. I'm going to assume that you're not new to YouTube and you know what buttons to hit in order to support if you want to support. I'm not here to tell you how to live your life. I'm just here to provide you with knowledge that I have. So I appreciate you sticking around to the end. Why don't you tell me what your favorite Big Four pattern is if you've made one, and if you haven't yet, what your dream Big Four pattern is.